Before we pass to Kate, I'd just like to say a few words about the conference. In 2001, the Centre for Refugee Research hosted a conference to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Refugee Convention. And that too was very well attended. At that time, refugee policy was very contentious, and it still is again now. Back then, we worked very hard. All of the delegates made strong recommendations about how they saw policy, how they saw refugee law, and how they saw we should be treating the refugees who sought asylum in Australia and who we invited as part of our resettlement programme. And I like to think that for at least some years in the intervening time, the results of that conference did impact on policy here in Australia. It's been a roller coaster of a time since then, I think, for all of us in the refugee advocacy field. I remember being at a United Nations meeting in Geneva, a meeting of UNHCR in Geneva, when the then Minister for Immigration of Australia strongly defended the Australian policy on detention. And at the end of his speech said, "It's not only a good policy, we're leading the world. Europe is following our example." Whereupon the representative from the European Union, Immigration, took the floor and said, "We might be following Australia's policy direction, but we're doing it with an adherence to the human rights framework." And I thought that was a very, very strong message for Australia to have got on the international stage. Some years later, I was with James Thompson from, again, we went to a meeting in the UN in Geneva. We arrived a bit late because of the way the planes came in as we walked into the meeting, which was representatives of UNHCR, academics and practitioners from around the world. We were greeted with a standing ovation and lots of laughter. He said, "Oh, this is very nice. You don't usually do this when we walk in." And they said, "Oh, but your government policy has changed. It's so good now. We're all celebrating." So that on the international stage, people watch what happens in Australia. The first time, I have to say, for the first time in my life since I took citizenship, I felt very ashamed to be Australian. The second time, I couldn't have felt prouder to be Australian. I think now we're at a crossroads again. Yesterday, a journalist asked me, "So you're celebrating the 60th anniversary of the convention. Is it still relevant in the world?" And I replied that personally, I think it's very relevant, extremely relevant. But we have to remember it's a body of law, and law is open to interpretation. And I think the critical issue is how do we interpret that law? How do governments interpret that law? I hope this conference is a good opportunity for us to debate that, to look at how we in Australia and in the region want to see that law interpreted, and how we want to make sure that Australia is never again accused of introducing policy and domestic legislation that cuts across the human rights of refugees, the most desperate people in the world, to claim asylum in our country or any other country. So with that, there are big hopes for the conference. I'd like to hand over to Kate Lundy. Senator Kate Lundy. Sorry, I've lost my place and I'm tired. Senator Kate Lundy from the Help. Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration and Multicultural Affairs. I apologise, Kate. Would you like to come and take the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen. I too would like to acknowledge the Indigenous elders. Dennis, thank you very much for your welcome to country. I pay my respects to your elders past and present. I want to thank you for inviting me here today. It's an honour to speak on this momentous occasion, 60 years of the United Nations Refugee Convention. We are celebrating the birth of a treaty and celebrating 60 years of protection, but in effect we're also celebrating more than 60 years of Australian resettlement. I'm pleased to be on this panel this morning with Rick Toll, the regional representative of the UNHCR, and I thank the UNHCR for facilitating my visit to the Mela and Umpium camps on the Thai-Burma border earlier this year. It was my first experience in a refugee camp, and one that affected me very deeply and informs my role as the Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration and Multicultural Affairs, which I'm sure you appreciate. Part of my responsibilities do include all of the resettlement programs under the Department of Immigration and Citizenship. I'm equally pleased to share the panel with Malika Yassin Sheikh Eldon from AIMS, one of our oldest and largest settlement service providers. Malika, it's lovely to see you again. And indeed, the list of conference partners for this event speaks to the role played by Australia's settlement sector, not in service provision, but in shaping the humanitarian voice of our nation. Back in 1974, Whitlam spoke at the 25th anniversary celebrations of the Good Neighbour Council of South Australia. He remarked that if we are to succeed in our objective of enabling people to settle happily and permanently in Australia, we must have the support of community organisations. From the beginning of post-war migration, Good Neighbour Councils operated to marshal community support for settlement. While initially councils focused on coordinating services, by 1968 their role had extended to include cooperation with all organisations interested or focused on migration and migrant integration, direct services to migrants where such services weren't available through agencies, and the Good Neighbour Councils enlisted the active support and cooperation of some 960 community agencies and thousands upon thousands of volunteers. They operated in every state and territory, and by the early 70s, their offices were supported by some 2,187 branch members. It was more than a service. These councils were a movement. They provided direct support to migrants and refugees, but they also gave structure to a movement to champion migration and settlement generally. The Good Neighbour Council model was a very early precursor to the now very professional network of migrant resource centres and settlement service providers that exist today. What they did do, what the Good Neighbour Councils did do, was create a direct connection between communities and the policy outcomes of Australia's migration program. And what I'd like to focus on today is the great strength that exists within the settlement services sector and their role in creating a sense of ownership and pride of Australia's continuing humanitarian program. Australia has a special relationship with the Refugees Convention. You all know we were involved in its construction in 1951. As the sixth country to do so, our ratification of the treaty on the 22nd of January 1954 set in train the process to bring the convention into force 3 months later on the 22nd of April. We were a founding member of the United Nations Advisory Committee on Refugees and the United Nations Refugee Fund Executive Committee. We joined the UNHCR's Executive Committee at its inception in 1958. And we are one of the few countries that operate an annual, well-established resettlement program. According to the UNHCR, Canada, the United States and Australia are the top 3 resettlement countries in the world. For the foreseeable future, there will be countries that persecute their own citizens, eschew human rights, or place the crusade for power and dominance above the lives of their most vulnerable people. And there will be people in need who will continue to turn to the international community when all hope is lost. Australia has a long-standing commitment of resettling refugees and offering protection to those in humanitarian need. The history of our humanitarian program is now the history of the people of Australia. It's part of our makeup. And I want you to bear with me, but I want to run through the list of the people who've come here through our humanitarian program. 170,000 displaced persons from Eastern Europe resettled between 1947 and 1954. 14,000 white Russians from China resettled between 47 and 85. 14,000 Hungarians resettled after the 56 uprising. 6,000 Czechs resettled after the Prague Spring in '68. More than 16,000 people from Central and South America since 1973. 18,000 Lebanese after the '75 civil war. 52,000 people resettled from the Middle East and Southwest Asia since the late '70s. More than 155,000 Vietnamese since 1975. Around 42,000 from the former Yugoslavia since 1991. 3,400 people from Sierra Leone since 1999. 3,500 Somalis since 1996. 12,000 Burmese since 2004. 3,000 Liberians since 2004. 29,000 Sudanese since 1996. 3,600 Ethiopians since 2000. 2,800 Congolese, the Democratic Republic, since 2005, and nearly 2,700 Bhutanese since 2008. The program is evidence that Australia is a generous nation, a country that looks beyond its own community to contribute and participate in the global society in a meaningful way. For people fleeing their homelands for their safety, perhaps after spending decades in refugee camps, arriving in Australia without English language, vocational accreditations or appropriate education, without social support of family or friends, and with little understanding of our culture, or perhaps a single asset to their name, it's an immense challenge. For humanitarian entrants, the pathway to becoming part of the Australian community is a process that takes considerable time, diligence, dedication and support. Confronted with learning new languages, skills and getting used to a different lifestyle, it's impossible to imagine in only a few short years how people could become as employable as those selected in our skilled path for migration. Yet more and more there's a push to conflate Australia's humanitarian program with the goals of our skilled migration program. The two programs enact wholly different mandates. One is a program of targeted labour recruitment. The other is a program of humanitarian restitution. The only similarity is that they have a visa of some sort. And in particular, I want to make mention of a statistic in a recent report commissioned by the Department of Immigration and Citizenship, the SONA report, stating that 85.5% of humanitarian households are in receipt of Centrelink payments of some description. This figure, which as I mentioned is from the SONA report, was used incorrectly to illustrate claims of poor integration of our humanitarian and refugee entrants. We know over 7 million Australians currently receive some form of Centrelink payment, and it includes all types, including family tax benefit, AMB, Austudy, the childcare rebate, and any kind of Centrelink payment that you could possibly name. If the same people that misused this figure had read the report, they would have understood that only 11.7% of participants in the survey identified as unemployed. The moment, and that started a public debate about how we bring together and understand the challenges faced by refugees and humanitarian entrants. And I reject the conflation of that program with the skilled migration program and understanding the outcomes as we move, as we support settlement through time. And the moment we begin to judge the settlement performance of our refugees and humanitarian entrants by the expectations set for skilled migrants, we begin to move away from a framework of protection based on need. Holding humanitarian entrants to standards used to assess the success of a skilled and educated workforce assumes that everything you and I have learned in a lifetime can be replaced by just a few years of adult education. This is both unrealistic and unfair. If any of us might experience sudden redundancy and begin the long, daunting road to re-establishing a whole new career, it would be fair to anticipate a slow recovery. It's a shock to the system and a battle that's uphill and unfamiliar and uncertain. In the case of humanitarian entrants, they encounter further obstacles of language and culture and past trauma. Often they're part of family groups where parents and children, each of whom face the same difficulties concurrently. All of these challenges need to be understood, and part of my role as Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration and Multicultural Affairs is to help educate the Australian public about the facts of the matter and the challenges faced by refugees and humanitarian entrants that we support through our settlement programs. Australia accepts humanitarian entrants, people who've been persecuted in their home country, people fleeing torture and war, because we see it as the shared responsibility of nations who can offer protection. As advocates for individuals and communities, we all assume a key role in how the discussion is framed. We all have a responsibility to present the facts and address the fears. In doing so, our goal should be to form a common understanding of the humanitarian program and its meaning. And whilst we might not always be in agreement, and there are certainly issues over which we will continue to have robust discussion, debate and conversation, we're all searching for ways to champion humanitarian Australia. The theme of this conference, looking to the future and learning from the past, is most apt. The telling of our national story In the telling of our national story, perhaps too little attention has been paid to our role in establishing an international human rights framework, to our history with the Convention, with resettlement, and to the contribution refugees have made. The story too often missed is that despite all that adversity, there exists a miraculous capacity for recovery and resilience. The SONA report, again, the Settlement Outcomes of New Arrivals report, illustrates this with the survey showing the absolute commitment to furthering education, to nurturing families and children, and to seizing opportunities wherever they're presented by refugees and humanitarian entrants. It's a remarkable study in the success of that the Australian environment provides and the way we settle our refugees. Acquiring appropriate workforce skills, sustained employment and the ability to contribute does in fact happen. It takes time, it takes an enormous amount of personal tenacity, and success is gradual because the task is hard. But Australia's humanitarian entrants fare better in achieving independence and participation in Australian society than in many other countries. Undoubtedly, this is a tribute to our settlement support services. It's also a testament to the character of this nation. And it is also a testament to the personal commitment of all of the professionals that have devoted their lives to contributing to better social justice outcomes in Australia. It speaks to our admiration of grit and determination and our attitude to giving everyone a fair go. On a global scale, our nation isn't a large one. Nonetheless, as one of the top 3 resettlement nations, we have made a choice to play a strong and important role in the international community in this regard. As a resettlement nation, we offer robust programs that are continually finessed and strengthened in response to the needs and on the advice of the professional service providers. As a result, Australia's refugees and humanitarian entrants do well, and we as a nation should be proud of enabling each small step forward against a background of such formidable hardship. Their successes in overcoming adversity is a cause for the whole country to celebrate. I urge you all and all Australians to feel a sense of ownership and participation in this humanitarian program that we have supported now as a government for generations. Be proud of its achievements. Help us celebrate the extraordinary outcomes and successes of refugees in this country. And I urge you to please continue the great work that you do in your advocacy for those in need. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to excuse myself as Parliament is sitting this week. I don't have to go just yet, but thank you very much for having me here to speak to you today about Australia's resettlement programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. I think that was a wonderful beginning to the conference, to hear and to be reminded of the incredibly positive things and great history we have got in helping refugees. And I think, as you said, we can all be justly proud of the record that we have. So that was a terrific beginning. Thank you. Kate has indicated that she was happy to take some questions before she goes, so we might have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Okay, so there's a lady here. You can just wait for a mic, please. Yeah. Take 2. Yeah. Would you speak first?
Is that ready to go? Yeah.
We'll take 3 questions and then Kate can respond.
Turning the volume up at the front there.
I'll try and speak a little louder for you.
Hi, my name's Nicola. I'm from the University of Western Australia. Thank you, Senator Lundy, for your comments. You mentioned that part of your role was to help educate the public about refugee experiences and challenges. Can you articulate for us a little bit about how you are going about that?
Look, one of the ways that we can do it as a government is highlighting and celebrating the successful stories of many of our refugees. We recently, for example, down in Melbourne, launched a publication by a community, in fact a Burmese Karen community down there, telling their stories of settlement. So it was a reflection on what they were able to achieve, what the challenges they foresaw, and how they were experiencing the settlement process themselves. So that was an important document for a number of reasons. One, it was the community speaking for itself. 2, the document really celebrated both their successes and the magnitude of the challenge faced, particularly people recently coming from the camps on the Thai-Burma border. And thirdly, articulating the aspirations of that community for both themselves and their children. So I think that kind of document helps build that understanding in the Australian community about the experience. I think the character of Australians generally is one full of admiration for people who endure such hardship. So for me, telling the story of the journey coupled with the experience in Australia, both the good and the bad, is a really important part of celebrating the success of refugees and humanitarian entrance here and understanding the magnitude of the challenge. There are other ways, including making sure that where you hear of extraordinary achievements, to lift them up and celebrate them. And it's a battle, I have to say, particularly in the mainstream media, but one I think that is not insurmountable. And I do see, I think, a growing number of stories and insights into the experience of refugees here. So I think it's improving, but it's something we can all do. I know many of the settlement service providers are fantastic sources of great news stories about what people are doing in their communities. So often we will ask that question and see if we can build some media interest around that.
Thank you. There was a question over there, please.
Okay, I think, yeah. Hi, Senator Lundy. I appreciate you being here today. I mean, it shows your interest in this matter. But I'm actually concerned still about the treatment of people with disability in the refugee area. I know that if people manage to get to Australia as a refugee, whether they're particularly onshore refugees, that they have a good chance of being of obtaining a refugee status. But those refugees who come to Australia and have a family member who has a disability are still very heavily discriminated against in that they're not allowed. And now, you know, we've moved from a system where just the person with a disability was refused entry into Australia to a system where the whole family can't come in because of one person with a disability. I'd really, really like to see a change in this. I can't see the sense in how this can be allowed to continue for so long. And as much as it may be, you know, a cost to the country to some degree, there are also contributions by people with disabilities, and I'd really like to see that being acknowledged and addressed properly. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that was more of a statement. I certainly acknowledge your point, and I do take a lot of advocacy on that specific point, particularly from organisations like FECA, who have a strong representative. They're representing people with disabilities. Obviously, the government policy hasn't changed and isn't likely to change in the foreseeable future. Lady, please. Yes, I think this lady had her hand up next.
Yeah, I know. I'm just going to take.
Yes, I've seen.
Is that what? Yeah, sorry. My name is Munira Mahmood from Melbourne, Farab worker. Just I want to focus on the point of the resettlement. And I know that Australia is one of the top resettlement countries known. And we are very proud, and we hear a lot about this because we have a lot of people from our community who live in other countries, and they really admire about the way how Australians resettle. In order to be more successful and the issues we have, and by the way, I'm representing the Women's Dialogue locally, so I came with some issues, and yesterday there are a few issues which I'm not going to go, of course, but there are main points which will let us to be successful resettlement. So the main thing is if we go back and see how refugee lives in refugee camps, that is the transitional timing. And that is the very important timing, because people been staying for a long time, 10 years, the transitional timing in a camp without education, without any health issues protected. All those issues comes to Australia, then mixing them with the people who are different than them, that will create as a settlement issue. So in order to have a successful resettlement, we have to really work very close, and we know that we are working very close with UNHCR in order to have some basic needs to be done and protected the refugee before comes to Australia. Yeah. Also the orientation, I don't know orientation how, sorry.
No. Keep going.
Short? Yeah, okay. So orientation is very important because people come with high expectation, yes, and here they've been shocked. So I don't know how serious and how much orientation is working. Sorry, I keep it short, thank you.
Yeah, look, just to pick up your point about cultural orientation, part of the settlement program is the AUSCO, Australian Cultural Orientation Program. That's recently being strengthened to have both an offshore component and an onshore component. Speaking from personal experience, having just come, as I mentioned before, from a visit earlier in the year to two camps on the Thai-Burma border, I was able to participate with the IOM in part of the cultural orientation course in the processing centre in Mae Sot before a group of refugees travelled to Australia. And it was such an eye-opener, because you're absolutely right. These people had spent 10 years in a camp, had never been anywhere near an airport, let alone on a plane. And then all of the characteristic expectations and aspirations associated with coming to Australia were profound in the conversations we were having, or I was having, with the group of refugees. One of the big issues about managing people's expectations through cultural orientation, I think, is understanding the diversity of Australian life, and employment and study aspirations were a big part of that. There wouldn't have been one person in this group that didn't aspire to go to university or to see their kids in university. it's really important to say that to people, only 30% of Australians graduate from university, and success comes in many different forms. My own personal background is one of having aspired to a trade certificate, but I was a labourer before I got involved in politics. And success in Australia is not on the back of always a university degree. And helping manage the expectations, just not down, but putting it into perspective. So when refugees come here, even though we know an immense proportion of them do go on to achieve a tertiary education outcome, in fact, remarkable statistics in that regard, it's not a determinant of success in Australian society. And I think understanding that and providing a broader feel and a better setting for what it is to consider yourself a success is a really important part of it. The research we're doing regarding qualitative outcomes of settlement and how people perceive the success of their own settlement, I think is informing further how we need to look at the cultural orientation program. And before I finish, I just want to touch on the onshore component of it. That was added to cultural orientation because there were so many unanswered questions once people got here, whether it was knowing emergency numbers, knowing how to get around accessing bank accounts, all these kinds of things that we all take for granted. I know it's core business for all of you in settlement services and supporting people get through some pretty practical hurdles that the rest of us are just used to, but we feel that that strengthens it. And further, the AMEP has also been structured and strengthened to be able to respond to more the needs of pursuing employment as part of their courseware as well. So there's lots of things we've done, we hope will continue to strengthen that need for cultural orientation and support once people arrive in Australia. So thanks for your question.
We will have time just for 2 more questions because I think you have to go.
Thanks,
There's a
Eileen.
lady over here and I'll come next to you. Okay?
Hi, thank you for coming along today. My name's Jana Favero and I'm from the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in Melbourne. I noticed that you detailed the successes of the settlement program and you said that they were proof that Australia is a generous nation. I'm just wondering if you also think our current approach to asylum seekers and policy of mandatory detention is also proof that Australia is a generous nation. And secondly, I applaud your quote saying that you want to help educate the Australian public about the facts of the matter, that we need to present facts and address fears and to champion humanitarian Australia. I would question whether our current leadership is doing that and presenting the facts on asylum seekers. And I just want to know if there's any hope that we will see some real leadership on this issue and present the fact that Australia actually does not have an asylum seeker problem and our only problem is how we treat asylum seekers when they arrive. Thank you.
I think the vast majority of the content of that question was a very strong comment from you, and I acknowledge that. With respect to your question about my view, we do face very challenging times. We do, as a government, have a policy of mandatory detention that is facing particular challenges at the moment. We are trying to work through those challenges, and I know you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of my colleague, the Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Chris Bowen, when he attends on Friday, and I will leave the details of those issues to him.
Look, yeah, mine was the same, basically. I just fairly disappointed, and I think probably there's several other people here too that are very disappointed that you haven't addressed the asylum seeker issue. Huge issue. For those of us working in the area, it's all-consuming, and it's very hard when you're working at a community level, and we have working in such a political environment, and the whole program, it would seem, is run through, fear, lack of proper information, and so on. So it's very frustrating, and it's very hard, I think, you often feel as if you're colluding in a very poor process, and when you work in the community sector, it makes it very difficult.
Can I just respond to that by saying the government is committed to making sure that the facts of the matter do inform the public conversation, at every opportunity, we make sure that the facts are A, available, and 2, discussed in context. Can I say the issue of asylum seekers does impact on resettlement as well? It changes the characteristics of the people that we're trying to settle. There's the impact of periods in detention on the resettlement challenge as well, and I acknowledge that. I am confident that our programs are able to adapt and respond to that. I'm not, in that regard, I have tried to address my comments in my area of my brief, which is resettlement, but I'm happy to take the point that, of course, asylum seekers and the processes that they go through in Australia does impact directly on settlement, and we need to make sure we can respond to those needs too.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you. And I wish you could stay with us longer, but it's been wonderful having you here. Thank you.
Thanks very much,
Thank
Irene.
you.